It's all part of the new way of doing worship in these strange times, isn't it? As we gather as church in this new way, it is so good to be here with you this morning. I'd say thank you for inviting me, but I don't think any of you had the choice, but it's great to be here. I've got the band Loitering with Intent to one side. I've got the rest of the team directly ahead of me, looking engaged and reflective, and I know you're at home. Let's seek God together as his gathered church. We're continuing our sermon series called Becoming a Church Amazed by Jesus. And this week we've just heard that amazing passage about Pentecost, often called the birthday of the church, as the church gets its new identity and commissioning all those years ago. Wow, what a moment. We're thinking about, as we go through the book of Acts, what it says about how Jesus is amazing. And I think, having been reading and praying through this, that this passage of Pentecost speaks of how Jesus is amazing in two very specific ways. Firstly, Jesus is amazing because he calls us to be his witnesses. He calls us to be his witnesses. And secondly, Jesus is amazing because he equips us to be his witnesses. Witnessing to Jesus' life, death, and resurrection seems to be at the heart of who the church are called to be. What this church God business is all about. So let's unpack these 2 points together. That Jesus is amazing because he calls us to be his witnesses, and Jesus is amazing because he equips us to be his witnesses. Let's dive into this passage from Acts 2, verse 1. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Who was this they? Well, we know this certainly included the 12 apostles. The 11 apostles minus Judas had just elected a replacement, Matthias. So it definitely included them, but it seems fairly clear that this was a bigger gathering than just those 12 faithful men. Because in Acts chapter 1, just before, we've heard how roughly 120 people were gathering together to pray together and to seek God after Jesus rose again from the dead. Now, this is why I find Jesus so amazing, because if I were Jesus, and I know that's a frightening prospect for all sorts of reasons, and I was tasked with working out how I was going to witness to my death and resurrection throughout the world, I may try and get some talent scouts looking for the brightest, the best, the most eloquent people out there. I might go on Indeed or another job search site to try and locate LinkedIn. I want to find people who are going to be eloquent, sophisticated, a bit like me, in other words, to do this. I'm joking, obviously, if you know me at all. But instead, what Jesus does is he chooses the people who are gathered in that room, that 120 people. Should we just review a few of the people who were gathered in that space? You had Simon Peter, whom a few weeks earlier had denied Jesus 3 times. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. You had James and John, who were known as the sons of thunder, essentially argumentative brothers. Great. What a wonderful addition. You had Thomas, who wouldn't believe until he had absolute firm evidence. You had a guy called Simon the Zealot, who, depending what point of view you take on these things, was either, before he followed Jesus, a freedom fighter or a terrorist. You had Jesus' brother there, who earlier in the Gospels we see being cynical and skeptical about Jesus, as only siblings can be. Who do you think you are, Jesus? We have Jesus' mother there. And mums are obviously the most wonderful people in the world, but they can also sometimes get under your skin and irritate you. I'm not saying Mary did that to Jesus. I'm throwing out the possibility. And also, you had some other women there, and forgive us for stressing this again and again, but in that culture 2,000 years ago, women were not considered appropriate or authentic witnesses legally or in society more generally. This was the maverick group of people, fishermen, tax collectors, broken, hurting individuals from a peculiar region in a backwater of the Roman Empire. This was the group that God was going to launch a new movement with. Jesus is amazing because he calls us to be his witnesses. He calls us to be his witnesses, us with our brokenness and our mistakes, us the hurting, the failures, the dropouts, us who have let one another and our friends and our families and God down again and again. Jesus chooses to proclaim the message of his death and resurrection throughout the world using us collectively. That boggles my mind. He'd use me. He uses you. He uses us as a community here in Southfields and East Putney and to the very ends of the earth to proclaim his death and resurrection. Jesus is amazing. And Jesus is amazing because not only does he call us with all our mess and desire and long to use us, however much we've messed up, he's also amazing because he equips us to be effective witnesses. Should we carry on and dive through this passage? Chapter 2, verse 2 of Acts. Suddenly, when they were all gathered together, a sound like a blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled, all of them. The woman, the broken, those who had denied Jesus, all of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. I love this passage. It's one of those ones on Jesus films that never comes across particularly well. The special effects never quite do it justice. And you get that when Luke writes these words. You get a sense that it was a bit of a you had to be there moment. As Luke asks those who witnessed these things before he writes it down, what was it like? Well, it was kind of like the sound of a rushing wind. Okay, so Jesus, the Holy Spirit came as a rushing wind. No, that's not quite it. It was kind of like that. And then it was kind of like there were tongues of fire on our heads. So there were tongues of fire. Well, sort of. No, I can't. Right, the Holy Spirit came, okay, and I can't describe it. You get a bit of that sense, I think, as Luke records what happens here. It was a you had to be there moment. But what's important is there were some sort of weird outward signs to mirror a deeper inward reality as all of these people, that the failures and the dropouts, the fishermen and the tax collectors, were filled with a purifying, amazing Holy Spirit that was going to equip them to be witnesses in Judea, Samaria, and to the very ends of the earth. Wow. And then what happens is this. Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. And when they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment because each one heard their own language being spoken. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Aren't all those who are speaking Galileans? How is it that each of us hears them in our own native language?" I love this for so many reasons, not least because it seems so unnecessary. People from all over the Roman Empire, these would have been Jews or converts to Judaism from all over the region, and all of them, almost without a doubt, would have spoken Greek or Aramaic. There was no need for them to be spoken to in their own language. This is bonkers. They would have all understood things if Peter had stood up and just spoken in Greek, as he then does, and explained things to them. But there is something here about what the Holy Spirit is doing as he launches the church with its purpose to be a witness to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. What I think, possibly among many other things, is going on here is this. When those 120 odd people, and there are roughly probably about 120 of us tuning into this morning, that's worth thinking about. When this gathering of 120 people receive God's Spirit to equip them, what that looks like is it enables them to each speak the language of the heart to those they are encountering. It enables them to realize that God will equip them to communicate the uncommunicable, if that's a word, to speak God's truth in impossible situations. Here, the earliest followers of Jesus have an encounter and realize that they are not left alone in this. Jesus will send the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit will enable them to do what needs to be done, to witness in Judea and Samaria, in Southfields and East Putney, and even to the very ends of the earth. I wonder sometimes what it is that we need from the Holy Spirit today to equip us at a church at this time and in this place to be Jesus's witnesses. And honestly, for myself, and I might be speaking for more of you, I think at the moment, often what we need from the Holy Spirit is just a sense of courage and conviction in the truth that we've been given. In a culture that relativizes everything, that says, oh, you share your truth and I'll have mine, that says get passionate about social justice issues, yes, and I'm all for that, but don't play up your own weird religious ideas. To have the courage to stand up in your families, in your homes, in your streets, among your neighbours, in your workplaces, and proclaim not just that the church does nice things, not just that this is a lovely social environment, but to declare that Jesus lived and died and rose again, and therefore the whole universe is different. I think what we need in this age from the Holy Spirit, as he fills us anew as his church, is courage and conviction. You may know that you need more than that, but I challenge you at this time. Why not pray for the Holy Spirit to fill us as a community again, to be people of courage and conviction in a world which is suspicious of both when it comes to matters of faith. I think Jesus is amazing because he calls us, the 120 odd of us gathered here virtually and in this building this morning, to be his witnesses. That's who he chooses, you. He chooses you. He chooses you, not just the clergy, thank goodness, you've met us, but all of you. I think Jesus is amazing because he'll take you with all your faults, your failings, and your mess, and he will equip you to do it by his Holy Spirit. Wow. I want to leave you with this. I grew up in a small village in Shropshire, and we were all desperate to turn 17 and learn to drive because the 297 bus stopped running after 5 o'clock, so it was quite difficult to have an active social life in Alverley, unless you could get to the banging towns of Bridgnorth or Kidderminster in a car. So I was really excited when I was equipped by my grandpa, who very kindly paid for my driving lessons so I could learn to drive. And then I was equipped by my mum, who very kindly allowed me to use her silver Ford Fiesta, lovely little car, to drive once I passed my test. I was equipped for the job at hand, and they entrusted me with that power and responsibility of getting behind a wheel of a car. 10 days after passing my test, almost inevitably, I pulled out of a petrol station and hit another car quite badly. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but the car was quite badly dented. And honestly, I don't think I've ever had a drive home where I felt so terrible. Here's what was running through my head as I pulled onto my family drive. I'd been trusted, I'd been equipped. My grandpa had spent his hard-earned cash to equip me to be a driver so I could drive to work and the social scene in Shropshire. My mum had entrusted me with a car, and I knew we didn't have a huge amount of money. We weren't well off, but we weren't poor. But I damaged her car. She trusted me with it. Oh, and I just remember pulling into the driveway and sitting there for 10 minutes in that dented car thinking, oh, can't believe I've done this. I've mucked up. They equipped me and trusted me. And man, what have I done? Do you know that feeling when your heart sinks, it drops? You're worried about disappointing people. And eventually, because it's quite weird having your teenage son just sit in a car on the driveway, even if there is a good Radio 4 programme on, my mum came out and opened the door and said, are you okay? And I said, Mum, the dent was on the other side. Mum, I've crashed the car. I'm so sorry. I've really mucked up. And she looked at me and said, are you okay? I went, yeah, I'm fine. I'm so sorry. She said, don't worry about the car. Don't worry about the car. You're okay. We knew you. We knew that when we were equipping you to do this, that you haven't yet got the experience. This was going to happen at some point. It's okay. We love you. Now, what we're going to do, Tim, is that when you're ready, we're going to get back in the car and you're going to drive again because I love you and I want to equip you once again to do this. It doesn't matter how much you've mucked up and fallen short, how dented your car is, so to speak. Jesus is amazing because he calls us, he calls you to be his witnesses. He's chosen you. Jesus is amazing because he equips you to do it. And he wants to equip you by his Spirit with the courage to do it in a world which is deeply suspicious of it. No matter how dented your car is, no matter how much you feel you've mucked up and you're beyond being an effective witness to Jesus, know this. He wants to open that car door and say, I've equipped you. I love you. when you're ready, get back in the car and go and be my witnesses in Judea, Samaria, in Southfields and East Putney, and to the very ends of the earth. Thank you.